Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it just a minute or two to let everybody else join the meeting. We're going to go ahead and get started probably in about 1 minute once I see the waiting room participants start to slow down. So just give us one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. We got a pretty big agenda to get through today, and want to make sure there's time to get everyone's feedback and discussion. So just give us maybe about 30 more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks. Okay, looks like it's slowed down, so I will go ahead and kick us off here. Um, First off, welcome everyone. Welcome to the October meeting for the San Diego County APCD Warehouse Working Group, or the WWG. We'd also like to note that this is likely to be the final meeting of the WWG, and we've greatly appreciated everyone's insights and perspectives and considerable time that you spent with us over the past year or so in talking about this important topic. The WWG was always envisioned to last about a year's time, and we're now coming up upon that year. And we've gained a lot of valuable information from stakeholders and everybody who's contributed to this conversation thus far. And we're going to continue that conversation with today's presentation today. As I mentioned, we do expect this meeting to be pretty jam-packed. There's a lot of good information that we're excited to roll out to you today. We're expecting it to go pretty close to the full 2 hours. But if we can't get to everyone, we're happy to continue these discussions offline. And as a reminder, we'll be recording this presentation, so you're able to take a look at it after the fact as well. There's going to be a lot of information, so you may have to go back and check it out. With that, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So before we begin, as always, we just have a few meeting announcements. Everyone except the presenter will be muted upon unless they're called upon by the host. We'd respectfully ask that you save your questions and comments until the end of each section, so that we'll be presenting. And finally, we'll be recording and posting the recording of today's presentations on the district's YouTube page. Following the meeting, they'll likely be up by the end of this week, if not sooner. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of what we're going to be covering in today's presentation. First, we'll take attendance and introductions of district staff and meeting participants. We'll then do a quick recap of the last meeting that we had in September. We'll then provide an update to the district's truck trip rate analysis that was presented at the June working group meeting, which we'll get into more detail today. We'll then discuss how those truck trip rates help us calculate the estimated baseline emissions and emission reductions that might be possible if an ISR rule is to be developed for warehouses here in San Diego County. We'll then briefly discuss EPA's recent approval of the South Coast Air Quality Management District Warehouse Rule 2305. And then we'll also touch on a recent assembly bill that was signed by the governor just recently on September 29th that will likely affect new and expanding warehouse operations statewide. Finally, we're going to go over some next steps following today's meeting with information about how you can continue to stay involved with us during the next phase of this effort. And then if there's any time permitting, we'll conclude with if anyone has any non-agenda items they'd like to bring up. So next slide. So now, as always, I'd like to just spend a few minutes just making some quick introductions. And then I'm going to go down the list of participants lists as I see it on Zoom, just to save some time. If you haven't done so already, we'd like to ask if you could include your name in Zoom, as well as your affiliation or of who you represent. And so we can just do a better job of tracking that on our end. So I'll go down the list as I see it, and I'll just introduce the staff members from APCD as well. So we've got Janet McHugh helping us behind the scenes from APCD. Miriam Sanchez also helping us behind the scenes from APCD. Amy Fawcett. Amy, would you be able to unmute yourself and state your affiliation, please? All right, we'll touch base with Amy after that. We have Alejandra Mira Teran from the Otay Mesa Chamber of Commerce, Andrea Wymore from Suja Life, Ariel Fiddledy from CARB, Claire Garcia. Claire, would you mind stating your affiliation or who you're representing today?
Hey, yes, I'm with ChargePoint.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have Craig Benedetto. Craig, you're representing NAIOP, correct?
That's correct, Nick. And I just put in the chat that Amy Fawcett is with the San Diego Working Waterfront.
Got it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Eric Leidig. Eric, would you mind unmuting yourself and letting us know what organization you're representing today?
Hi, my name's Eric Leidig. I'm facilitating for Suja Life, Suja Juice. I'm with Adrian Wymore as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I see Greg Gelani from CARB, Jack Munger representing Industrial Environmental Association, Justine Murray from San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce, Lauren Cazares from San Diego Chamber of Commerce, Michelle Giron from Port of San Diego. We have Randy Consolation here from APCD, who you'll hear from in a second. Regina Sue from Earth Justice, Sam Peterson from UCSD. Someone's gonna have to correct me on this one. Tiam Novin, Tiam, would you mind unmuting yourself and stating your affiliation?
Hi, yeah, my name is Tiam Novin. I don't mind how it's pronounced. I'm with GSI Environmental Consulting Firm.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see. I see Tim Garrett from Sandag. Tim Pohl. Tim, would you mind stating your affiliation one more time?
Yeah, it's Tim Poley with Beverage and Diamond.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that.
No.
Victor Mendiola from CARB. I see Yasi Kavasari. Sorry. If you want to correct your name, Yasi, I'd appreciate it, and then state your affiliation, please.
You're good. I'm with Sierra Club National. I'm a senior advisor.
Great, thank you. And then I see Zach Friedlander from TRC Companies. Is there anybody, it was jumping around a little bit on me on Zoom. Is there anybody else that I missed in going through the list? Okay. So thank you, everyone. And I apologize if I butchered your name throughout this whole year's process. I will try to get it right as we move forward. Appreciate everyone. And I think we'll go ahead and get going into our first slide of our presentation today. And for that, we're going to start with our Warehouse Working Group September meeting recap. And for our last meeting in September, staff presented an overview of the Sandag 2022 Commercial Vehicle Survey and how specific elements could support our efforts into knowing more about the truck and warehousing industry, specifically in San Diego County. We also provided an update on the second year of implementation for South Coast AQMD's Rule 2305, including the points being accrued from different menu options and the challenges being encountered from facilities reporting and the resources to implement such a program. We also provided a brief comparison of Caltrans truck counts versus in comparison to Sandag model data. And then finally, we noted some additional data sets on the cost of ZEV trucks, as well as further refining warehouses that might be subject to a possible rule in the future. Some comments we received at the meeting included investigating potential feasibility for implementation of ZEV trucks for short trip operations, whether APCD would be tasked with providing compliance assistance if a warehouse ISR were to be developed in San Diego, In regards to AQMD's second year of implementation presentation, we noted that there was the warehouse industry may be receptive to investing in ZEV technologies now, which is encouraging, and that the reporting rates for Rule 2305 have been on the lower side, suggesting a possible overestimate of facilities subject to the rule, or that operators are just not compliant. And finally, opining about the possibility of warehouse operators choosing to move into smaller warehouses that might be less than 100,000 square feet, and potentially in an effort to avoid being subject to the Rule 2305 up in South Coast. So those were some of the comments we received at the last meeting. Are there any other questions or comments or things we'd like to make sure are noted from the last meeting before we get into the first topic of today? I'll just pause for a second to make sure we've got everything. Michelle?
I just want to make sure. So previously, at the previous meeting, you compared the modeling results with the real world results. At a meeting before that, I made a comment about verifying whether the models are accurate, and my comment was more about on an individual warehouse level, like setting the streets around one warehouse, as opposed to looking at these large models, like all of the traffic compared to the freeway traffic. So I just wanted to put that on the record to make sure that you understood what my comment meant.
Yeah, I think I understand the comment, Michelle. You know, that's still something that we're going to probably have to take a look at. But yeah, we do understand that comment and where it's coming from. But I appreciate you bringing that up. Are there any other comments or feedback on the September meeting? Okay. Well, with that, I think we'll go into our first presentation of the day, and I will turn it over to Randy, who will present on our updated truck trip rate analysis. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Randy to not steal his thunder. So Randy?
Thank you, Nick. Staff presented some initial truck trip rate analyses at the June WWG meeting. If you weren't able to tune into that presentation, we recommend reviewing the recording of that meeting that is available on APCD's YouTube page. Today's discussion will provide an update to that initial analysis. Next slide, please. We'll start with a review and a mini refresher of the information covered in the June WWG meeting on how APCD intends to develop a methodology for a truck trip rate analysis in San Diego County. This slide discusses the data sets that we used and an overview of the methodology. The analysis starts with the development of an inventory of warehouses throughout the county. This was done through data that the district obtained from a real estate information service called CoStar. Activity-based model, ABM, data was then obtained from Sandag. ABM2+ data contains heavy-duty truck volumes, which uses 2016 as the base year. ABM2+ supported Sandag's 2021 regional plan. Things to note about the ABM data are that 1, it is model data instead of actual truck counts, and 2, the data is several years old. Nonetheless, this data is the most recent publicly available dataset that staff can utilize for this analysis to determine proof of concept. The CoStar and Sandag data were then incorporated into a map created by the county's GIS department. Staff then looked at several warehouse clusters throughout the region and analyzed the truck volumes on street segments near warehouses to estimate warehouse truck trip rates. Next slide, please. The truck trip rate analysis presented at the June WWG meeting has since been further refined and updated based on valuable feedback from stakeholders. Instead of using street segments, the refined analysis now utilizes polygons known as traffic analysis zones, TAZs. These zones, shown in the black polygons on the slide, use the Sandag ABM modeled truck volume data, but organized in a different way. This map is a visual of the approximately 5,000 TAZs in the San Diego region. Each TAZ is identified with a number ID and contains the total daily truck volume entering and exiting the zones. Of the 5,000 TAZs in the region, 819 zones were identified that contain one or more warehouse buildings. Next slide, please. As an example, this slide shows a zoomed-in map of the TAZs shaded in purple located in the Poway region. The red box represents a cluster we assessed previously. The area highlighted with the cyan border is TAZ number 1964. The information box located to the right of this TAZ contains data for that specific zone. For this TAZ, the total truck volume entering and exiting that zone per day, as shown, is approximately 1,098 trucks. The total truck volume is the sum of light, medium, and heavy duty trucks. In addition to truck volumes, the total number of warehouses and the total warehouse square footage were derived for each TAZ through assistance from County GIS. Next slide, please. Here are some of the key findings of the updated truck trip rate analysis. Overall, the updated analysis shows a stronger, positive, linear relationship between warehouse floor area and truck volume. What this means is that in general, as warehouse square footage goes up, truck volume also goes up. The updated truck trip rates developed are also the most conservative we've been able to calculate, meaning that these are the smallest values to avoid the potential for overestimating possible benefits from a possible ISR, which previous analyses may have done. These updated truck trip rates, with the exception of one outlier, also have values of less than 1 trip per 1,000 square feet for each warehouse size category in the clusters assessed. This is significant because these values are within the range of other reference values found in other datasets we've researched, some of which were presented at the June WWG meeting. For these reasons, staff believes that the truck trip rates derived in the updated TAZ-based analysis are best suited for estimating baseline emissions for the San Diego region. Next slide, please. To conclude this section, we'd like to just remind everyone of how and what estimated truck trip rates could be used for. If the district is directed to develop an ISR, potentially similar to South Coast AQMD's Rule 2305, truck trip rates are an integral but small piece to the development of a rule. The truck trip rates would primarily be used in 3 ways. First, they may potentially be used as default values in the rule for warehouse operators to calculate their respective truck trips. The district calculated truck trip rates would only be used if actual truck trip count information is not available. Any district calculated rates wouldn't be used if a facility reported their truck trip information as required. Second, the district calculated truck trips may also be used to determine the level of requirements a facility would need to comply with. Finally, truck trip rates would also be used to calculate baseline emissions for nitrogen oxide, NOx, and particulate matter, PM2.5, which we'll get into more in the next agenda item in today's meeting. Next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Randy. So that was a quick overview of what our truck trip rate analysis comprises of. And so we're going to be sharing a little bit more about those truck trip rates, the actual numbers, in the next section of our presentation, which will also get into the emissions. So you'll have a chance to take a look at those in the presentation. But first, we'd like to pause for a second to see if there's any feedback or questions that you may have about the analysis that we've created for truck trip rates. We first want to make sure that the methodology is understandable, and that if there's any questions, if we can better clarify, or make better sense of it. It's a pretty technical topic that we're trying to simplify as much as possible. But we're ready and willing to help clarify if we need to provide more detail. And then second, if staff should consider any other aspects of the calculation in our truck trip rate analysis. So if anybody has any questions or feedback, we'd be more than willing to take it at this point. And I see Michelle Drone's hand up.
Hi. Okay, so one of your key findings was that there was a greater correlation between the floor area and the truck volume. So I wanted to know if you can explain to us what are the inputs in the model? How does the model work? Because if it is looking at the amount of traffic that would be generated based on several different inputs, which could include square footage, for instance, I'm not sure if it's in there, then aren't you getting the result you would expect because the model is built that way?
Randy, I don't know if you have any perspectives to offer on that question.
Yeah, let me just try to explain a little bit of how the calculations were done, and perhaps Michelle, you can certainly jump in if you have any need any more clarification. But basically, think of the TAZ as a zone modeled within Sandag's model. That basically we know from that information the total number of trucks, including light, medium, heavy, entering and exiting that particular zone on a typical day. The only thing is that of that volume, we don't know what is specifically going to warehousing activity. So that was something that we had to create an adjustment factor for. So that's one. The second is also we don't know of all the warehouse square footage within that particular TAZ. We don't know specifically how much of that square footage is being used for warehousing activity. That's another unknown. So that was another adjustment factor that we had to create in order to do that. So basically the analysis, given total volume, total warehouse, tries its best to adjust to target only one, the truck volumes specifically going to warehouses, and two, the warehouse area that is being used for warehousing activity. So I guess to answer your question, it's not necessarily getting the answer that we want from the model, because the model was created for another purpose. It was created to support the regional plan that has nothing to do with warehousing activity necessarily. But we, however, took that information because it's the only information that we have in order to try to estimate truck trip rates. In the absence of this modeling analysis exercise, we would have to rely on other references, including the ITE, which is the Institute of Transportation Engineers, what South Coast had done in preparation for their Warehouse Rule 2305, and other rates. And we kind of discussed that in the June meeting as a point of reference, because at the previous analysis, we had preliminary information in regards to these are the truck trip rates. We compared them to how the other reference rates looked. And for some size categories, they look pretty high. So we suspected that one, the analysis wasn't correctly capturing or joining the warehouse square footage with the appropriate truck volumes. So through this exercise, with the numbers being more conservative and more in line with other references, we have a higher degree of confidence in terms of the truck trip rates that were estimated. Does that answer your question, Michelle?
Well, okay, so we have these presentations you're giving, but there's not a lot of documentation or material for us to review. So first comment is that it would be very helpful for us if we could have more information so that we can better understand the model and what the inputs and the outputs are. The second part of my comment, are you saying that you're basically taking the Sandag model and modeling a TAS and then you are taking a portion of that traffic and attributing it to warehouses.
Yes, that's correct. Mhm.
Okay, so what I'm not understanding is why you would present it as a greater correlation between floor area and truck volume, because that's what you would expect to see with the model, because that's how the model is built. It might be that it's taking an industrial land use and generating truck traffic from it, but that is going to be correlated with the amount of land that is industrial, right? And that's going to, you know, align with the floor area of industrial or warehousing.
Yeah, Michelle, I think, sorry, go ahead, Randy. I'll follow up after you make your comment.
Sure. We did basically a comparison between the correlation coefficients that we estimated with the preliminary analysis compared to this one. And we basically saw an improvement for each of the clusters. So there were 10 clusters in all, including Portside and International Border. So because we saw an improvement, we concluded that this TAZ-based analysis provided better results because the improvement was across the board. You could see a perfect correlation is 1.0, and you saw figures go in between like 0.9, close to 1, as compared to before in the previous analysis where the numbers were a little bit lower. So not as strong of a correlation. So yeah, to answer your question, I mean, yes, the model might already be there, but we're trying to show that this way of using the information is appropriate.
Thanks, Randy. And I would just add in relation to your first comment, Michelle, and I appreciate the feedback that you're providing. And you know, this is something, the data that we're going to be that we're talking about here. It's always a challenge, I think, in the meeting of this setting to, you know, how much information is too much information, especially when there's a lot of people who are at different points of coming into this analysis. So, you know, rather than getting too far into the weeds of providing, you know, table after table, you know, I think that we wanted to try and summarize the information as best we could in today's presentation, but we understand and hear your feedback that more information would be better. And that's one thing that we're hoping to do as part of a supplement that we're putting together that would be coupled alongside our original ISR framework document, that we're working on a supplement to it that will provide all the transparency and all of the information and all of the spreadsheets and kind of all the gory detail, so that everybody can have a chance to take a look at it and respond, and we welcome feedback on it. Understandably, it's a little hard to do that at this point in time with the information that we presented today, but we do certainly welcome that feedback and want to get some feedback on that once it's ready to present. And we'll have some more information a little bit about that later in the presentation, but message heard.
Okay, thank you. And I would just ask that the public has a chance to review this information well in advance of you taking this to your board. Yes,
certainly. That is one thing we've committed to doing, and we fully expect that we'd have a full 30 days of review. Once it's out in the public sphere, we'd have at least 30 days for the public to weigh in and provide comment on that, and that would be prior to any governing board consideration or consideration of what the next steps they intend for us to be. So that is a commitment we are planning to take. I see a question in this chat. It looks like from Craig. I'll just read it for the betterment of the recording. When will that be available? I think that's in relation to the supplement, I'm thinking. Given the density of the information, we'd appreciate receiving it with enough time to digest and respond to before a public hearing. So I think hopefully my response to Michelle, Craig answered that question. We are intending to provide a full 30-day review period. And there's going to be a lot of information. So, we do expect that, there's going to be a lot of information there, but we are hoping that we get a lot of feedback and a lot of review from stakeholders in the room, both here and beyond on that. So, are there any other questions, feedback on the truck trip rate analysis information that Randy just went through? Okay. I think with that, we can go ahead and move to the next phase where we can, of the presentation, where we can get into a little bit more about how the truck trip rates are then utilized to prepare our emissions and our baseline emissions and emission reductions that could be a potential for an ISR if one is to be developed. So Randy, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you again.
Thank you, Nick. We're now going to discuss the next of the district's analysis, which is to explain how we are preliminarily estimating the baseline emissions and possible emission reductions if an ISR were to be developed. Next slide, please. To determine how much emission reductions a possible warehouse ISR could achieve in San Diego County, we first need to determine the baseline emissions emanating from the source category. This flowchart illustrates the methodology at a high level. First, the calculated truck trip rates with the TAZ analysis that were discussed are combined with known warehouse building square footage to calculate the total number of truck trips. Then combining this with information from the SANDAG 2022 Commercial Vehicle Survey, CVS, including truck trip lengths to and from facilities, the total vehicle miles traveled, VMT, were calculated for warehousing activities throughout the region. Then, following the methodology developed by South Coast AQMD during the development of their Warehouse Rule 2305, composite emission factors were calculated using CARB's MFAC for the various truck classes. Using VMT and the various emission factors together, NOx and PM2.5 exhaust emissions were calculated with 2024 as the baseline year. These emission estimates include both running and idling emissions. Baseline emissions were then forecasted to 2032 using the MFAC Mobile Emissions Toolkit for Analysis, or META, online tool, a tool South Coast AQMD used for their emission estimates for Rule 2305. We'll be showing the baseline emissions in a few slides combined with the possible reductions. Next slide, please. With baseline emissions calculated and using preliminary information available and known at this time, potential emission reductions were calculated that may be achieved if a warehouse ISR was developed for San Diego County. In line with the board's direction, staff assessed the applicability threshold for a possible warehouse ISR for two size ranges: warehouses 100,000 square feet or more and warehouses 50,000 square feet or more. The estimated baseline NOx and PM2.5 emissions were forecasted to 2032. Staff then looked at two main emission control options the warehouse ISR may implement. The first is a requirement to use low NOx trucks, which would result in a 90% NOx emissions reduction compared to standard diesel trucks operational today. The second control option is the use of zero emission trucks, which will result in 100% NOx and PM2.5 emissions reduction. Since any warehouse ISR would provide a menu of compliance options for facilities to choose from, some of which may not directly reduce NOx and PM emissions, the two control options evaluated are best case scenarios that would result in direct emission reductions, assuming all subject facilities select the low NOx option or all select the ZEV option. The resulting emission reductions for low NOx and ZEV options would be the best case scenarios of what a potential ISR may achieve. However, in practice, the actual emission reductions may likely be less due to facilities selecting other menu options for compliance. Looking at the right side of the flowchart, the baseline NOx and PM 2.5 reduction estimates were then compared with CARB's MFAC Meta online tool. This process allowed staff to estimate emission reductions from various state regulations in the region. Note that these statewide emission reductions are forecasted to occur even if a warehouse ISR for San Diego is not developed. Notably, CARB's MFAC Meta tool does not include the reductions from the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, or ACF. As a result, the CARB emission reductions calculated here are likely less than the actual emission reductions from all the applicable rules. Finally, surplus emission reductions that may be achieved from a warehouse ISR were estimated by taking the difference between the potential ISR emission reductions and the forecasted CARB regulations emission reductions. The surplus emission reductions are the additional reductions a warehouse ISR may achieve beyond those forecasted from CARB regulations. Next slide, please. Using the methodologies for estimating baseline emissions and potential reductions, staff then evaluated 2 truck trip rate scenarios because estimating baseline emissions is dependent on the truck trip rates used. Scenario 1 calculates baseline emissions for the entire county with rates for each warehouse size category. For example, 100,000 square feet and above, between 50,000 and 100,000 square feet, and so forth. Scenario 2 calculates baseline emissions with rates for each warehouse size category, but instead of looking at it county-wide, the calculations are based on 3 specific areas: the portside community, the international border community, and the rest of the county excluding those specific AB 617 communities. The following slides will list the trip rates calculated for the 2 scenarios and their respective baseline emissions and reductions. Next slide, please. This table shows the truck trip rates calculated and used under Scenario 1 for the entire county, with rates for each warehouse size category and the light, medium, and heavy-duty truck classes. Next slide, please. Using the rates shown on the previous slide under Scenario 1, evaluates an applicability threshold by warehouse size of 100,000 square feet or more. Under the scenario, 243 warehouses would potentially be subject to a warehouse ISR. Assuming a best-case scenario that all subject facilities were conducting warehousing activities and implemented the low NOx trucks option to comply with an ISR, the county-wide surplus emissions reduced would be about 16 tons of NOx per year, highlighted in green. PM 2.5 emission reductions would not be credited in this compliance pathway and in similar subsequent tables because diesel and natural gas engines are certified to the same PM standard and thus there are no reductions to be claimed. However, significant diesel PM emission reductions would be anticipated as a co-benefit from the transition of switching from diesel fuel to natural gas combustion. Assuming a best-case scenario that all subject facilities implemented the ZEV option, the county-wide surplus emissions reduced from a warehouse ISR would be about 20 tons of NOx per year and 0.4 tons of PM 2.5 per year, highlighted in blue. Corresponding surplus reductions for the portside and IBC communities are also shown. We'd like to note that these estimated surplus emission reductions may be on the high end because they do not account for CARB's Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, which may provide additional emission reductions even in the absence of an ISR. Next slide, please. Under the same scenario, staff then evaluated the baseline emissions and potential reductions if the applicability threshold of an ISR were lowered to 50,000 square feet or more. Under this scenario, approximately 657 warehouses would potentially be subject to an ISR. This is about 400 facilities more than those with the 100,000 square feet threshold. Again, assuming all subject facilities implemented the low NOx trucks option to comply with the potential ISR, staff estimates the surplus emissions reduced would be about 33 tons of NOx per year, highlighted in green. Under the ZEV option, surplus emissions reduced would be about 42 tons of NOx per year and 0.7 tons of PM2.5 per year, highlighted in blue. As a reminder, this was scenario 1, which looked at truck trip rates assigned to the entire county by warehouse size. The following slides will go over scenario 2, which does a similar analysis but assigns truck trip rates to the individual areas of the county instead, specifically the portside and international border communities and non-AB 617 areas. Next slide, please. Similar to scenario 1, truck trip rates were calculated for the 3 areas evaluated in scenario 2. This first table shows the rates used for the portside community with rates for each warehouse size category and the various truck classes. Next slide, please. This next table shows the rates used under scenario 2 for the international border community. Next slide, please. And finally, this table shows the truck trip rates used under scenario 2 for the rest of the county, not including portside and international border. Again, as a reminder, these truck trip rates are preliminary estimates and are subject to change. Next slide, please. With the truck trip rates calculated for each of the 3 individual areas, scenario 2 evaluates an applicability threshold of 100,000 square feet or more under a potential ISR. Under scenario 2, up to 243 warehouses would potentially be subject to a warehouse ISR, which is the same as the number of warehouses as scenario 1. The countywide surplus emissions reduced, if all facilities selected the low NOx trucks option to comply, would be about 17 tons of NOx per year as shown in green. Countywide surplus emissions reduced, if all facilities selected the ZEV option, would be about 22 tons of NOx per year and 0.4 tons of PM2.5 per year as shown in blue. Next slide, please. Like scenario 1, the lower warehouse size applicability threshold of 50,000 square feet or more was evaluated under scenario 2. The same number of warehouses potentially subject to an ISR is the same as scenario 1, which is up to 657 warehouses. Surplus emissions reduced with facilities selecting the low NOx trucks option would be about 35 tons of NOx per year as highlighted in green. Surplus emissions reduced with the ZEV option would be about 45 tons of NOx per year and 0.8 tons of PM2.5 per year, highlighted in blue. Next slide, please. That was a lot of information and tables to go over. So this table summarizes the information presented in the previous slides. These are the county-wide baseline emissions and surplus reductions that would be anticipated under scenarios 1 and 2 with applicability thresholds of 100,000 square feet or greater and 50,000 square feet or greater. We'll summarize what we're seeing out of these numbers on the following slide. Next slide, please. As shown in the previous slide, scenarios 1 and 2 yield similar results depending on the warehouse applicability threshold evaluated. The difference between scenario 1 at the 100,000 square feet threshold and scenario 2 at the 100,000 square feet threshold was minimal. This potentially indicates that using area-specific truck trip rates would not yield substantially better emission reduction estimates. Secondly, staff determined that preliminary estimates of possible emission reductions that may be achieved through a warehouse ISR were likely overestimated due to more refined information, calculation, and analysis that occurred over the past few months. For example, the scenario calculated by staff that would net the largest potential emission reductions estimate is 45 tons per year of NOx reduced. Using EPA's COBRA screening tool to estimate health benefits, this emission reduction results in possibly avoiding as many as 294 cases of negative health endpoints and 214 lost work or minor restricted activity days on an annual basis. These would contribute as much as $4.6 million to the economy annually from avoided healthcare costs and lost productivity. In comparison to estimates presented in the 2022 Regional Air Quality Strategy, which estimated that an ISR may result in 142 tons per year of NOx reduced, and the ISR framework prepared last year by staff, which estimated up to 182 tons of NOx reduced per year, the numbers being calculated now represent a substantial difference than originally forecast. That said, staff believes that new truck trip data from SANDAG may show an increase in activity compared to the 2016 data used, which may affect the surplus emission reduction estimate. The estimates are also very conservative because the baseline NOx and PM 2.5 emissions were calculated using reasonably and defensible truck trip rates with high statistical correlations. Also, the emission reductions forecasted from CARB regulations do not include the Advanced Clean Fleets ACF regulation, which are likely to net additional emission reductions even without an ISR developed. The analysis also shows best case scenarios, assuming all subject facilities would choose the low NOx or all would choose the ZEV option. In practice, this would likely not occur as subject facilities would have a menu of compliance options to choose from to best suit their specific operations. Note that some of these options would not require low NOx or ZEV purchases or truck visits. As presented in past meetings, many facilities use other options to comply with South Coast AQMD Rule 2305. Finally, staff believes that considering that the emission reductions from CARB regulations in our methodology does not currently account for the effects of ACF, the estimated surplus emission reductions shown today may likely decrease if ACF benefits were incorporated in refined analysis. Next slide, please.
Right. Thanks, Randy. Take a breather. So that was a lot of information, and I'd encourage everyone else to take a breath on that too. There's a lot of information there that we presented, but we would like to open up the discussion again at this point as we've gone through this analysis. This has taken some time to get to this point. This is something that we didn't necessarily think we could get to back in June of 2023, where we could provide a San Diego County specific kind of forecast and information to look at smaller warehouses using San Diego County specific information. So, big kudos to Randy to getting us to this point in time on this analysis. We do have some questions that we would pose for the group just to get the juices flowing to start discussing this. First, again, we want to make sure that, there was a lot of information we threw out there. We want to make sure, does this make sense? Is there anything that we can further clarify out of this that, would be more helpful to perhaps connect the dots in what you're thinking? Second, and after digesting these numbers, and the key findings that are coming out of them, do you agree with staff's interpretations? Is this or with our insights, or are there other interpretations that you think we should be aware of? So things like that, we'd be open for your feedback on that. We do have our presentation uploaded on the website. I know we ran through that pretty quick, but if anybody's looking to kind of go back to the presentation numbers, we do have a link on our website that could get back to that presentation. You can kind of peruse that at your own will. So I see, I'm gonna just note the comment in the chat from Alejandra, and then I see your hand up. Maybe I'll go to Alejandra first with her hand up, and then Tim Garrett from SANDAG.
Thank you. Well, first of all, good afternoon. And my first question I put in the chat, why would you not include the ACF estimated reductions in pollution. And then I'm kind of surprised you asked if we agree. I guess I have to say no. I'm kind of surprised the international border is being, I guess, slated as the Inland Empire when it's so different. I mean, we've proposed and explained there are 3,500 trucks idling that you're not considering on the border fence that you can stop easily by promoting a reservation system at the port. And that would really reduce pollution versus this plan that's from the Inland Empire. So I'm really surprised that you're not looking at a unique way or a strategic way in terms of analyzing real pollution reduction in the border area. When these numbers, you said it, I mean, they're very conservative. I would also like to look at your worst case scenarios in terms of pollution reduction, because they might end up being zero, because the sources are not even clear that it's the truck, especially if we consider the ACF ruling. It might be the vehicles in the San Ysidro border crossing, it might be the Tijuana airport, for example. So I also think you should not just put best case scenarios, but worst case scenarios, and try to propose something creative for the international border.
Yeah, thanks for the comment, Alejandra. I guess I'll try to respond to the question about ACF first. So that is something that eventually we're hoping to try to do, is to try to figure out what that impact is in regards to advanced clean fleets. It's not a simple question. It's not a simple question to kind of figure out. This is something that actually South Coast is also grappling with as well, in a different sort of way. But you know, that it's not as simple as taking the reductions from what you know, CARB thinks that we can get in San Diego, and then applying it just blindly to what we think we can get in San Diego. There's a lot of overlap there that we're still trying to come to grips with and see. You know, we have a sense for how much reductions we might be able to get from ACF overall in San Diego County, but then to kind of tie that with whatever strategy we move ahead with, be it a regulatory strategy or a non-regulatory strategy, there could be a lot of overlap there. So it's a difficult task to try and nail that down. It is something that we're going to continue to try to work on, but we at least wanted to provide a response based on what we know at this given time with the numbers that CARB has available at this point in time. And as Randy mentioned in his presentation, they have data that's out there that's available to us that goes up until the point of ACF. We're hopeful that in maybe in the next couple of months or years or whatever, however long it takes, that CARB will update their online meta tool that would include and be able to extract that number out from the benefits from ACF, but it's not there yet. So we'll have to continue to see how that might impact things. But we do want to be sure that we do believe that those reductions are likely to lower the numbers that we presented in our presentation of what we could potentially achieve if we were to go to the extent of if our board directed us to go with an ISR. That is clear. We do think that the number that we're presenting today is kind of the best case number that could be put forth and what we could expect to achieve if everybody did selected a certain option, if we did the approach that was similar to the Inland Empire South Coast rule that you're mentioning. So we at least wanted to put that information out there. I probably mistook in my wording on if you agree with it or not, but we're just looking to get feedback and get some perspectives of what people were thinking about the numbers that we're seeing today. And on your question about other strategies, like you mentioned, the border appointment system, potential, or us taking the approach that South Coast and the Empire have done with warehouses, that's still all up in the air right now. I think what we've presented here today is, if our board was looking to potentially do something in the model of a South Coast rule, which we now know has survived some level of legal scrutiny, You know, we wanted to at least see and get to this point where we could understand what the reductions would be if we were to use San Diego County specific data and looking at it in a couple of ways that our board has asked us to do. So, you know, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion about what direction we may take. That's probably something we're going to have to take more of a thought, have more thought over as we dive more into this supplement document that we're going to be working on. It could be perhaps that there's either a number of strategies or maybe one strategy that gets landed on that could include something along the lines of what you're talking about. You know, but we'll have to just kind of wait and see where it all shakes out. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but we're hoping to in the next couple of weeks to months. Let's see. I think Tim Garrett was next, and then I see Jack Munger.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Could you please contextualize? I think you said like $6.5 million in health benefits, or I think that might have been the number. Could you contextualize that in terms of other rules that APCD might be pursuing, or you know how that compares to the health benefits from the South Coast rule? $6.5 million. I'm just curious where that lines up. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. You know, the only thing that's coming to mind in terms of context to other regulations that we've locally adopted that are coming to mind are, and it's not even a regulation, I guess, but it's when we adopted our regional air quality strategy in 2022, I think we used the EPA's COBRA screening tool to get that estimate of health benefits and then the economic contributions to the region that would come from you know, less or more productivity and less negative health endpoints like asthma cases and that sort of thing. So the numbers that are in my head, I think if you were to adopt all of there was like probably 7 or 8 measures that were included in the 2022 RACs. All were to, if they were adopted, would reduce oxides of nitrogen or VOCs. And I want to say the number for that at that point was around $18 million in total contributions to the economy. You're welcome to take a look at that regional air quality strategy on our website to get a more accurate number, but I think it was around 18 million. I don't have a specific number for context on a specific other regulation right now, but as it's somewhat of a new thing for us to present that sort of information, but we're trying to do a better job of that. So we'll probably present some information for an upcoming rulemaking that we're probably doing in November for furnaces. We'll probably have some of that information made available. I don't have that information offhand right at this point, though. So if you want more information on that, you're welcome to reach out to me, and I could probably provide some better accurate information for you, Tim. All right, Jack.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Randy, for the work that has obviously gone into this and the time and presentation today. Just 3 comments. One, to reiterate what Alejandro raised, which is the being able to account for carbs. ACF rule would just, I think, help put this in perspective. I appreciate how hard it is, but so I'm hopeful that you're going to be able to do that here as this moves forward. Secondly, you were just talking about the health benefits that were mentioned, and what I'm wondering is at what point will you show the balance in terms of cost? Obviously, we would have health benefits and you know, savings from reduced absenteeism, that sort of thing. But what would be the cost to industry to implement those same strategies, so you can see whether or not what sort of balance there is between health benefits and costs. Finally, it was also mentioned that the study assumes 100% participation from everybody here. We know that's not happening in South Coast, and in fact, the involvement, as I understood it, in terms of those that have filed appropriate initial paperwork with the district is at like 50% or very close to that of those that were anticipated. I don't know, like you said, I don't know if that's a poor compliance or an overestimation of how many businesses would be required to file, but I think it would be helpful to be able to look at the anticipated benefits and what would happen if, for example, we had that same level of non-compliance or whatever, again, whatever it is, in San Diego. I mean, if it was 50% of what was anticipated in terms of warehouses reporting, where do you anticipate that there for a period of time there would be a 50% reduction in the emission benefits? So I think since that's based on a real-time experience up north at South Coast, it would be interesting to look at how that could affect us if the same thing occurred here.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate the comments.
Sure.
And yeah, we'll do our best to see if we can land on a number with ACF. That is a challenge that we've been, like I said, we thought it would be a little bit simpler, but with air districts, not just us kind of trying to figure that out, it hasn't been as easy as we would have thought, but we will nonetheless keep trying to figure that out. We understand that's an important component. Not sure if we're going to be able to get there in the short term, but we're going to keep trying on the ACF benefits. On the health benefits and looking at it in context, I guess, is what you're trying to get at in terms of the cost of compliance versus the estimated health benefits. I think I would just add onto that, the supplement that we're going to be producing is intended to be a supplement from the framework document that we put out back in June. And the June document does present some cost information that we thought was in looking at some of the South Coast metrics and doing some research on what happened up there. We did have some fairly robust cost estimates in that, and so what we'd like for people to understand is that we want the entire suite of documents, I guess, to be considered in relation to one another. So while the cost information may appear in the ISR framework document, and then the updated health benefits and emission information would be in the supplement, we think that those two can kind of work in concert with one another, and that we're not trying to replace some of the information that was found in that framework document. So I think within the context of that, we're hoping stakeholders can look at those two and be able to get to, I think, where you're trying to go with that is to look at both sets of information. And then,
okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And then understand the question on the participation rate, I guess, and these numbers being kind of a best case scenario and maybe looking at it at a more, I guess, more realistic scenario about what's happening maybe in South Coast as a potential proxy about what may happen here. That's something we can definitely look at. We want to try and better understand what's going on at South Coast, and that's part of the reason why we presented that information in the past couple of working group meetings to see how are things going there. Will it be a direct proxy? Probably not, because there's a lot of ways that they're complying with the regulation up there that aren't necessarily applicable to San Diego. And for that matter, there's a lot of compliance activity happening with making use of zero emission yard tractors, for example, in South Coast. Well, San Diego is a little bit different story when it comes to yard tractors. We just don't have as many as that region does. So could we make a complete and accurate comparison? Possibly, and then coupled with that, there's going to be enforcement activities happening that will increase likely the rates of compliance and reporting with South Coast over time. The information we shared was a little dated and unaudited at that point from South Coast, but it was the best we had at that point. So, but understand, I think I understand where you're going with that, and if there's any more context that we could provide that could shed a little light of what we would realistically see, we'll think about including some of that in the supplement here.
So Nick, what is a yard tractor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably should say that. So, yard tractor, I guess, would be it's typically something that's used at a distribution center that stays on site, and it's used to move containers in and around the warehouse distribution facility, whatever you want to call it. They don't typically go up, on the road. They stay within their little domicile, and they just move containers back and forth. We do have some of those here, those kinds of operations, but we don't have as many as the Inland Empire and South Coast region does. It's possible that some facilities here are just using regular trucks to do that kind of operation. That could be possible. We've seen that. But yard trucks is something that we just don't have as many of down here.
All right, thanks.
Sure, thank you. Let's see. I see Alejandra's hand up. I've seen Alejandra. I don't know if that was another hand up and then I'll go to Michelle, but I just want to check if Alejandra, did you want to jump back in on this, Alejandra? Okay, we'll check in with Alejandra in a second. We'll go to Michelle.
Hi, so I have two parts to my comment. The first one is I want to note that AQMD passed their rule before Advanced Clean Fleet was adopted. This effort is occurring after it was adopted. And we have discussed many comments in previous sessions about how we want Advanced Clean Fleet emission reductions to be analyzed in this effort. And so I think we have been expecting that to occur before you bring this back to your board. The second part of my comment is in relation to the emission reduction that was put out there in the ISR framework. You mentioned this in this presentation, but I don't know if you actually quoted the number. So am I getting this right? You said in the ISR framework that, I'll just read it. I think this is in relation to 100,000 square foot warehouses and above. If adopted, a local rule could be expected to reduce NOx emissions by as much as 50 tons per year. And according to the presentation today, the baseline emissions for 100K and above is not even 50 tons per year. Am I getting that right? Because I just want to comment that you set a very high expectation in the ISR framework. And I think that should be, you should compare in future documents the very high estimation from before to your current estimations, because you would expect much lower emission reductions, especially with Advanced Clean Fleet reductions.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I mean, I think our presentation here today is part of an acknowledgement of what you're saying. The information that we've put out thus far with using, we mentioned the regional air quality strategies estimate of what a possible ISR might be able to get. And then the ISR framework document, which you mentioned, also had a similar, a little bit more refined estimate at that point. Both of those were really created without the refinement of, San Diego County specific traffic data. And so that was one thing that we were tasked from our board, was to really hone in on and try to figure out what's going on here in San Diego County. And I think our information that we shared today, like you're saying, is somewhat of acknowledgement that, previous estimates were pretty high on that. And what we think we can get, even under the best case scenarios that we presented today, are likely to be high, based on the different caveats that we talked about, ACF, the ability to select different compliance options, which is an unknown factor really that is difficult to pinpoint what people may do and if they were to comply with such a rule. So, the numbers likely continue to go down and down a little bit more from what we presented today, and that's why we are presenting it as a best case scenario. I think it's probably expected that we'll reference some of those older numbers. Like I said, this supplement is probably not going to be treated as a standalone document. It should be looked at in context with the framework that we put out in 2023. That being said, if there's areas that we need to correct or update, and this is clearly one of them, that is the intent for what we're trying to do with this document, is to update it with the most up-to-date information that we have at this point in time. And so, I can dare say that we'll probably make sure that that information is presented in context to what you're saying. And then in terms of the note about the ACF benefits, again, we're going to try our best to get to that point. If there's any numbers or any way that we could potentially, if anybody has any information about how we might be able to tease out ACF benefits in San Diego County, but not being able to potentially overlap emission reductions with ISR or other ways, we're all ears. Understandably, that's something that a lot of people have requested up to this point. We just haven't been able to get the right level of information to be able to kind of tease that out. We'll continue to talk about it, and if we're able to put some information out there that could provide additional context for that in this supplement, we'll certainly do that. I just cannot guarantee that we'll get to that point.
Estimated emission reductions when they were making the rule. Can CARB help you estimate the emission reductions for San Diego County related to warehouse activity?
We can speak with CARB offline about that. I think that's possible. I think we do have some estimates about what that could be, but we'll chat with CARB to see if that's a possibility that we can nail that number down a little bit more. Okay, and then I see in the chat, let's see, I'm just going to catch up with the chat here. I see Michelle posted a link about some different workshops on MFAC updates that will be coming soon to include ACF, so that's useful. Thank you, Michelle. We'll definitely be tuning into that. And then Alejandra mentioned potentially estimating the health benefits of reducing daily idling of 3,500 trucks right at the border fence. That's an interesting idea. We'll have to think about that a little bit to see what that might look like and if we're able to do that. I would actually also put out there the EPA's COBRA screening tool that we're using. That's a publicly available tool. It's available. I'm sure if you Google it, it's probably the first one that comes up. It's EPA's COBRA, COBRA. It allows you to present, and make some tweaks to whatever scenario you're looking at and what emission source you're looking at. So if you really just have a sense for how much emission reductions you're able to achieve in whatever project you're looking at and whatever region you're looking at, it's actually available to anybody in the public to take a look, to use and kind of refine those numbers. So I would encourage anybody that is interested in that to feel free to take a look at that as well, so you could run the numbers on your end as well. Are there any other comments, questions, feedback on the emissions and emission reductions? Probably not right now, but I'm sure there'll be more in the coming months and weeks ahead. So we'll provide some more information at the conclusion of our meeting to kind of where we're going from here. And this isn't the end of the discussion, I'm sure. But I think it's probably a good time to then pivot to our final couple of slides of some important information that we wanted to make sure everybody was aware of. So I think we'll go ahead into the next slide, kind of take us home over the next couple of sections here. So for this last section of today's meeting, we're going to be briefly mentioning two additional aspects that are pertinent to this group. This includes a summary of EPA's recent federal approval of South Coast Air Quality Management District's Warehouse Rule 2305. And then in a very recent development, there's going to be a brief summary of new state bill, Assembly Bill 98, which was signed by the governor on September 29th. And that bill may potentially affect warehousing and logistics operations statewide into the future, and certainly has some context with the effort we're talking about with warehouses. Next slide, please. So on September 11th, the EPA approved South Coast AQMD's Warehouse Indirect Source Rule 2305 as a SIP strengthening measure rather than a full approval. Though EPA made clear that the rule was nonetheless still federally enforceable, full approval of the rule was not granted due to specific deficiencies identified by the EPA. These deficiencies included two ambiguous definitions that cite California's Code of Regulations that have not yet been approved into the SIP, and the rule's inclusion of a sunset clause, meaning if the rule were to sunset in the future, it had the potential to interfere with reasonable further progress or attainment of the national ambient air quality standards, and represented a potential inconsistency with the Clean Air Act. And then finally, there were two instances within the rule of a concept known as unbounded director's discretion, which potentially allows the district to undermine enforceability of a SIP regulation. Due to these deficiencies, the EPA could not assign credit in the State Implementation Plan, or SIP, for the emission reductions that will result from Rule 2305 up until the deficiencies are resolved. This is something AQMD may seek to rectify in future rule amendments. While Rule 2305 survived a legal challenge in federal court, it remains to be seen if further lawsuits could be filed as a result of EPA approving the rule into the SIP now, and on what grounds such a lawsuit could be filed. I will go ahead and ask one of our team members to post a link in the chat to the relevant Federal Register notice that approved this action so that everyone can take a look at the approval on your own. It is pretty informative, but it is a little bit of a long read, so I'd encourage you to take some time to read it over. Next slide, please. So another development that occurred since our last working group meeting was the passage of AB 98, which was passed by the state legislature in late August and then signed by Governor Newsom on September 29th. Again, I'll probably ask my team to drop a link in the chat to links to the language of the bill so you can peruse it yourself. AB 98 is a new law that will apply to new and expanded warehouses that are proposed for any floor size, though more requirements appear to be required for facilities being proposed over 250,000 square feet in size. District staff are still trying to understand and digest the bill, but some of the requirements of the bill will include building standards for new and expanded warehouses, minimizing impacts on certain sensitive receptors, including residences, schools, daycares, public parks, nursing homes, and hospitals, minimum distance requirements between homes and warehouses with buffer zones, and for some warehouse categories and sizes, all forklifts and specific equipment serving the warehouse should be zero emission to comply with CARB requirements. This bill is frankly something that caught a lot of groups and people off guard, and the staff will need to further evaluate what impacts it might have in relation to any regulatory or non-regulatory strategies that the district ultimately pursues. It does appear that the bill is primarily affecting new and expanded warehouse operations, which could mean existing warehouse operations may not be as impacted, which could still allow some opportunities for those warehouses to benefit from either local incentive programs or other non-regulatory strategies that could be developed. Next slide, please. So with that, again, we're going to pause and see if anybody has any questions, feedback, other information about these two developments that have happened over the last month or so, either on EPA's approval of South Coast Air Quality Management District's rule into the federal SIP, or on Assembly Bill 98. I will pause for a second and see if anybody has any comments, questions, concerns. Michelle.
So this is regarding AB 98. There's another important piece of this, and that's the requirement for cities and counties to update their general plans circulation element and with some requirements that are specified in the bill. And I just want to highlight that this is an opportunity for you as the Air District to comment on these revisions during the environmental reviews. And it's in line with the indirect source program that has been in your regional air quality strategies that discuss working with local governments, land developers, citizen groups, and nonprofits on their planning generally.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback, Michelle. That is something that we were aware of as an additional element to this, and that's a good comment. We'll consider that moving forward. Jack.
Thanks, Nick. I was just wondering, with regard to those deficiencies noted by EPA, as far as the Rule 2305, is that now going to be treated as an audit would be, where those deficiencies have to be addressed, or are they just out there for the record and that's it? How are those handled?
Yeah, that's a good question. We probably need to have South Coast or someone from EPA on the line to fully answer that, but I would suspect it's probably in the court of South Coast to either correct those deficiencies if they feel the need to, or it has been approved as a SIP strengthening measure, so it is federally enforceable. I think it's really, if I had to surmise, it's really just a matter of if they want to go to the extent of gaining the credit from the emission reductions they would achieve in this regulation on the books with EPA as part of their air quality management plan. My suspicion is that they would probably want to go into the rule to fix those deficiencies to then get the credit that they're seeking. I'm not speaking for them in any way. I have no idea really what they're thinking on that. I see Ariel's hand up, so I probably said something wrong, but that would be just purely speculation on my part. But Ariel, you may want to correct me if I've overstepped my speaking.
No, I don't think you've overstepped at all. I just wanted to clarify something. This is Ariel Fiddledye at CARB. I'm one of the managers over one of our SIP teams. Work a lot with all the districts on their SIP rules and SIP plans. But because what EPA's action actually was, it was an approval. There was no aspect of it that was a disapproval. It was not a limited disapproval, partial disapproval, anything of that nature. It is pretty much fully up to South Coast, right? There are no clocks that were started that would result in sanctions or anything of that nature, which is what usually comes from a disapproval of any kind from the SIP. But since that is not the case, it's just SIP strengthening measures are often measures that are not necessarily they aren't required to kind of check a specific SIP box, but they do, they are strengthening and helping things in the SIP, which is the way it is approved as a SIP strengthening measure. So there's not a disapproval piece of it. So it's really, like Nick was saying, it's up to AQMD to kind of decide if they want to do anything based on those, identified quote unquote deficiencies, or if they want to, leave that as is, since there isn't any sort of clock ticking.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel. Appreciate that. That's good feedback. It's something we'll probably be keeping an eye on as well, to see what they do. We have regular conversations with AQMD on different aspects, and so if we learn of any potential thoughts from their end that we could share, we'll certainly pass it along. But at this point, I'm sure they're still digesting the news a little bit and trying to figure out the best pathway forward. So, are there any other questions and feedback, especially in relation to, we know AB 98 was a fairly recent development. And like we said in the presentation, there was a lot that happened in a very short period of time within that to create that legislation. I'm not sure if others have any feedback or perspectives to offer on how that legislation might impact warehouses both in the county or statewide, or how it might work in relation to even efforts up in South Coast. With their rule on the books, it'll be interesting to see how that works together and how they're seeing that play out. I don't know if others have thoughts or perspectives of what they might consider happening in relation to this new bill, but it's something we're going to be keeping an eye on as we move ahead in our effort.
Nick, this is Craig. May I speak?
Sure.
So it was a gut and amend bill, and it came in at the last moment. So I think everybody that is going to be impacted by it is attempting to understand its implications on, certainly for the South Coast, but also around the state of California. It's also not the last salvo that's going to be fired in this battle. The author of that bill has sworn that she will come back in the next legislative cycle to make it even stronger. So, part of our arguments here, you've heard some of it earlier about the data not really supporting the specific conditions on the ground here in San Diego. I would also suggest that given what's happening at the state level, doing local rules doesn't make a whole lot of sense either, because you have to figure out and constantly potentially change what you're doing. And you're going to, this is potentially based upon what I heard today, going down the path of a rulemaking, through next year that could potentially be dramatically impacted, not just by this legislation that just was signed into law, but by a subsequent legislative cycle next year. So just something to consider as you move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. This is definitely one that surprised us, and it surprised a lot of people when it was adopted and signed. But understand this is something we're going to have to keep an eye on with whatever pathway we move ahead with. Like I said, we'll have a slide in the next section that kind of will talk about what we think are the next steps on where we're going with this effort. Again, probably would push back a little bit on the assumption that we would be pursuing a rulemaking. At this point, that's a decision that will ultimately be up for our board to determine. But this is certainly going to be AB 98 certainly will have some impact to what the whole conversation will be about, because there's a lot of new requirements in there that weren't there, even just a month or two ago. So we're going to have to account for that accordingly. Excuse me. Okay, I think we'll probably move on to the next slide. I think we're almost done here. So to close out, we've kind of reached the end of our working group meeting series here, and we wanted to just leave everyone with some information as to the next steps that we intend to take here at the district, so that stakeholders can continue to remain engaged as we proceed in this effort. So here are some things that staff are going to be working on moving forward from today's meeting. Staff are going to be taking in the comments we received today and all the way through this whole working group series. And then we're going to be looking to finalize or get to a point where we're most comfortable with the truck trip rates and baseline emission estimates and the emission reduction estimate calculations that you saw today for giving adequate context to this discussion. As we mentioned, there's an ISR framework supplement report that we're going to be preparing that will summarize the working group discussions and the district's analysis to date. And that's where we're hoping to provide a lot of that transparent, show our work kind of information that in all the detail that I think a few have indicated they want to see. This supplement is going to be followed up to, as mentioned, it's going to be a follow-up to the framework document that we prepared in June 2023, and it will include the more technical analysis and information that we presented in the working group discussions today. The district is hoping to make this report available for public review and comment at least 30 days prior to any consideration or decision-making opportunities to our governing board. And that will ensure that the feedback is collected and incorporated into any board item. We don't have an exact timeline yet for when this will be made available, but we're hoping to get it out for public review before the end of this calendar year, if not sooner. This week, we're also going to be presenting a version of today's presentation to APCD's Planning and Policy Committee. That was a request by one of the board members on that committee late last week. So we're going to be presenting a very similar presentation this week on Thursday to that committee, which is the plan. If you're not familiar, the Planning and Policy Committee is a subset of our governing board members, and they tend to get into more technical conversations and have the opportunity to get into more detail. Staff at that presentation, staff is not going to be requesting or recommending any significant actions from PPC members, and nor will they be voting on any said action. Following the review period of the ISR framework supplement, we're expecting to seek direction from the governing board in early 2025 on a direction of where to go. If the governing board directs staff to pursue an ISR, then staff would then refine the cost effectiveness estimates, the public health benefits through a socioeconomic impact assessment, or what we call an SIA. And then we'd also have to kick off required environmental processes required under CEQA. We'd also like to acknowledge that we'll be further exploring another approach that was presented to us last week in the letter submitted to us from the Environmental Health Coalition, which proposes a regulatory approach to reduce indirect source emissions from warehouses that are specifically located in disadvantaged communities and from warehouses falling within 1,000 feet of a sensitive receptor, such as a school, park, or senior center. APCD is still reviewing the concept a little bit more just in the coming weeks with our legal counsel. I think if EHC is or one of their partner organizations would like to further elaborate on this proposal, we'd be certainly to open up a minute or two to expand on that letter. I'm not sure if anybody wants to do that, but if so, feel free to raise your hand. I don't know if there was an EHC representative on the line today, but if not, we can go ahead and otherwise move into our final slides of the presentation. All right. So if there are no other questions or comments, this would be a good opportunity to provide any other information, non-agenda items that anybody might have in the room. I'd go and pause for a second to see if there are any non-agenda items that we went through today that would be of benefit to the group. If not, I think we can go to...
Nick, can I just ask a question quickly?
Sure.
I'm not quite sure I understand what the EHC was proposing the Air District do, but I guess just kind of tapping on that, I mean, if the regulated community were to propose a new plan, would the Air District be obligated through this process to analyze and come back with a response to it?
I think we'd certainly, I mean, we're going to be treating all, proposals equally and considering anything that we would receive. I don't think there's an obligation for any specific avenue that we have to act on said information, but we'd certainly be interested to see. We've had some information shared to us from up to this point from another representative that's, I believe, I don't think he's here today, but Andrew Aguilar has presented some very good information that we've been taking to heart and looking at and seeing what we could pull from. And EHC has now submitted their letter. If there's another opportunity to present a different proposal or information that you wanted us to look at, we'd be all ears.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, I think, I see Michelle's hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the letter that you talked about, which I haven't read, but isn't there, and I can't remember which health and safety code it is, but there is a law that says that the air districts have to make rules that are uniform across the whole air basin, right? I can find it, but that proposal just seems to be out of line with that.
Yeah, like I said, Michelle, we're still evaluating the proposed the idea that was pitched. We are still discussing that with legal counsel to see what abilities, you know, we would have. But generally speaking, I think you have a pretty good understanding of what we've known to date. That there would be a uniform kind of approach to rulemaking. That's at least historically what we've done across the region. There have been some instances in the past on air toxic rules where there have been more abilities to focus rulemakings into certain specific areas. But that's an area, again, that we need to further investigate and talk with our council about to see how much of that would apply for criteria pollutant reduction type of rulemaking like this. So that we're still digesting the information, frankly, and are hoping to learn a little bit more about it in the coming weeks. Okay. I think if are there any other questions or comments? I think we have only one more slide after this. Okay, so I'll just kind of wrap this up here. So again, this is our contact information for me and Randy. Do please continue to reach out to us with any additional questions, information, proposals, you name it. Just feel free to reach out to us. We're very open and willing to having conversations about this moving forward. We are entering the kind of next phase of this work with the conclusion and the wrap up of the working group. But we certainly don't want this to be the last opportunity that everyone, you know, feels like they, you know, can't reach out to us anymore. We do welcome and appreciate all the feedback that we can get as part of this effort moving forward as we transition into kind of a new phase of it. We would like to certainly express our deep appreciation and thank everyone for their diligence and patience. You know, providing a lot of time. Everyone has provided a lot of time and effort to attending these meetings, which are long at some points. And I think we totaled it up. It's probably going to be about 20 hours all told of conversations. So that's been extremely helpful and insightful for us. And we do appreciate you carving, you know, a lot of time out of your normal workday to be involved in this discussion. And do please be on the lookout for this framework supplement that we've been talking about. We are eventually going to be putting it on our website. We're going to be, if you're signed up for our warehouse working group listserv, we'll be posting on the listserv to make sure that you have that and are ready to review that the moment it's available. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone before we wrap things up today. Jack, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Nick. So I have one last question, and that is for those who, and maybe you said something about this when you were talking about it, but it's for those who would like to get a copy of the EHC letter. How can they do that?
I will have to talk with maybe a few folks on my end to see how we might do that. If we're able to post it on our website, that might be the route to go to put it with our presentation materials and the recordings under this meeting agenda. So I will have to confer maybe on my end before I do anything with that, since it wasn't it was addressed to APCD in particular. So I'll have to see what channels it might be if we can release that. But it's possible that information could get disseminated. I just don't know how yet. But we'll make sure if we can do it, we'll go ahead and try to figure out a way to do it.
I appreciate that. It seems that it being a public record written or a item submitted to a public agency should be available to the public. So I appreciate if you'd look into that.
Sure, we can look into that. Okay, are there any other closing thoughts? If not, again, I really appreciate everyone's time and attention, and looking forward to the next phase of this. But thank you, everyone, and we'll keep in touch. Please reach out to us if you have any further questions or comments or want to chat about this effort. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for everything, Nick and Randy. Sorry.